From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Romulo Lollato will go over the findings of a two-tiered study of foliar fungicide applications to winter wheat in the spring. He combined results from a direct farmer survey on their fungicide use with multiple years of K-State field trials to come up with conclusions on the value of employing those treatments. Then, over from the Farm Service Agency, Tonya Ackerman provides an update on 3 USDA programs, including the results of the latest Conservation Reserve Program sign-up here in Kansas. And on this week's edition of Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk will take a look at putting up fall forage as high-moisture baleage. All that coming up on this Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us for Agriculture Today. We are deep into the wheat planting season in Kansas, and it's timely that we bring in once again Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, for some perspectives of his on how planting is going so far, and mostly today about new research that's been released out of his program at K-State that looks at the returns to the use of fungicide treatments on wheat. Before we get to that, though, Romulo, wanted your observations on just how well this new wheat cropping season is going in Kansas to date. With the recent moisture, that really lifts the spirits of wheat producers, doesn't it?
Hi, Eric. Yeah, most definitely. Let's talk a little bit about the wheat planting conditions for this fall. Back in September, the planting conditions, they were not very favorable there for wheat. I mean, we could get the crop planted, but essentially there was kind of a limited amount of moisture to get that crop emerged. Now, there was some precipitation during that week of September 29th through the 5th of October, anywhere from half an inch all the way to about 1.5 inches, depending where in the state. So that definitely helped that early planted crop because it was pretty widespread precipitation there. Mostly in the west central and central parts of the state, so really beneficial to a lot of the wheat that was early planted and to growers who were actually looking to continue their planting. So that precipitation already helped the crop quite a bit, so we were seeing a chunk of the crop emerged already. Again, after that precipitation in late September, early October, I think that our planting progress progressed quite a bit again, but things were getting dry again, right? So again, because of those windy and relatively warm conditions. And then mid of last week, we had another precipitation event where we had anywhere from half an inch to about 1.5 inches in most of the state. So again, this last precipitation event probably is going to put on halt planting for a little bit, but for sure it will benefit the fields that were already planted, and it ensures that right now we have the moisture that we need to get that crop established as well. So what we're seeing is that this week the weather forecast is actually pretty clean. We don't have much rain on the forecast, but there's moisture in the topsoil for the majority of the state. So what I would recommend is that growers who are intending to plant winter wheat this fall to try and take advantage of this moisture that we have in the soil right now, right? And those fall formed tillers, they are extremely important in our winter wheat yield determination. So the earlier we get it out there, planted, emerged, and with the potential for tillering from some of these fall temperatures still, the better. So we can actually try and capitalize on some potential temperature accumulation now in the fall. Even though these days have been pretty chill here recently, we're still accumulating some temperature as we're getting to warm conditions in the afternoon. And of course, we don't know when the next rainfall is going to be. And so taking advantage of the moisture right now would be ideal for these two conditions. First, making sure that we have enough moisture for the seed to embed and to emerge. And second, to make sure that we give the crop maximum potential to tiller, so we're not planting too late.
by and large off to a far better start with the Kansas crop this year than the dryness of last fall. That's to be certain. It's very encouraging. Do want to dwell some here, though, Romulo, on new information that you've released out of K-State on the value of using a spring foliar applied fungicide on winter wheat. What you've done here is paired up a couple of approaches, looking not only at previous K-State research into this, but getting producer survey input as well.
Absolutely, Eric. And so essentially, we're trying to do things here a little bit differently, right? Looking at an old problem, but perhaps through new lenses, right? What can we learn from existing data and what can we learn from our growers, right? So that's the dual approach that you were mentioning there, is combining long-term data that was developed through K-State Research and Extension on fungicide applications with a survey of management practices that we did directly from growers during 3 growing seasons there, 2016, 17, and 18 harvest seasons, where we were collecting data from commercial fields on what management practices growers were adopting in those fields, as well as their yield levels. So essentially what we did there is in the experimental data, we went back for about 12 years. So from the growing season of 2008 all the way through growing season of 2020, working together with Eric DeWolf from Plant Pathology, who provided a lot of the data that we used between that 2008 and 2015 time frame. And then from 2016 on, we also added many of the data that we collected in our own research program in agronomy. So right there, we had data from near 60 experiments that were conducted over those years. And so you can imagine the range in environments that we had throughout central and part of western Kansas as well. So we had environments with very different growing conditions, from optimal growing season like 2016 to a very dry growing season like 2012 or even 2018. So we had very contrasting environments where we were looking at the experimental data. Same thing for the grower data. We had the 2018 year that was extremely dry, and we had fields in western and central Kansas, all the way through 2016, which was an awesome year in terms of yielding conditions. So we were actually able to collect some very vast databases on both producer and experiments to try and quantify not only what's the average yield gain from foliar fungicides, but also how is it depending on weather, how is it depending on the variety that we're selecting, and how things compare between field experiments and commercial fields.
Well, let's go right through each of those areas of interest and talk about what you found. For starters, what percentage of producers are actually employing a fungicide application?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was interesting that we noted that across those 3 years, right, 2016 through 2018, roughly half of the producers were applying foliar fungicides, single fungicide application around that flag leaf emergence. Then we had about 4% that were doing a dual fungicide application, so one earlier at that jointing stage and then another one following up at that flag leaf emergence. And the remaining producers, so roughly that 46%, were not applying fungicides at all. So it was pretty well balanced in terms of half and a half there of producers that were using and producers that were not using fungicide. Now, what was interesting to learn as well is that eventually we divided all those almost 700 fields that we collected data from into fields that were in dry seasons. And this is regardless of year, right? We're just looking at each growing season specifically in each field, fields that were dry, intermediate, and moist. And it was really interesting to notice that in very dry seasons, only 20% of the fields were actually getting fungicide. In intermediate seasons, we were about half of the fields that were receiving fungicides. And in wet years, we had up to close to 70% of the fields receiving foliar fungicide. So that was interesting to notice that growers, they are paying attention to the conditions that the crop is being exposed to, and they are managing according to that. Of course, we like to try and hope that some of that credit is actually due also to K-State Research and Extension putting out the word in those wet seasons, say, hey, we are seeing stripe and leaf rust developing south of us. Let's be aware of the need of fungicide. And so it was very interesting to notice that the percent adoption of fungicide depended on dryness of that growing season. With wetter seasons, we're seeing more fields adopting fodder fungicide. But it was also interesting to learn that the other tool that growers have in controlling those fungal diseases are genetic resistance, right? So we looked at the varieties that were being adopted in those commercial fields and how they ranked in terms of susceptibility to major diseases. And roughly 70 to 80% of the fields, they were planted to varieties that were at least intermediate to resistant to either leaf or stripe rust. And only 20 to 30% of the fields were actually planted to susceptible varieties. So that was interesting to notice as well, because we see that growers are using both tools that they have in their toolbox, right? One of them, they're starting the season already with a material that is at least intermediate or resistant. Again, 70 to 80% of the fields were in that scenario, and that decreases the likelihood that they will need a fodder fungicide. But then, again, we had about 30% of the fields to susceptible varieties. And in seasons where we had greater rainfall amounts, then growers are also adopting fungicide, even in fields that had these intermediate or even resistant varieties. So that was very interesting to learn that in commercial fields, growers are actually applying some of the concepts and some of the knowledge that is being developed at K-State.
You put all of that together then, you did eventually analyze the actual yield gains from these practices and using those tools in the toolbox. And we want to dig into that bottom line, if you will, Romulo, after a quick break right here. We're visiting with Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Once more, he and colleagues here at the university have just completed a thorough study of the benefits of using fungicides against prominent foliar diseases in wheat in the springtime, including the rust disease complex. We'll be back with Romulo very shortly here on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today is back now and picking back up on our discussion with K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. He's been spearheading a research project, the results of which were just announced, a multi-year look at the use of foliar fungicide applications for controlling damaging diseases in the wheat crop. And again, to remind folks, Romulo, you combined multiple years of research data by K-State with a 3-year survey of agricultural producers on their fungicide use tendencies. And that has created this comprehensive view of the practice. But in the end, what is most interesting to the producer, of course, the impact on yield. And you did generate numbers to that effect.
Yeah, so if we look at the grower data, right, we're not talking about the experimental data here, we're just talking about the grower data at this point in time. In dry seasons, we were still seeing a yield bump from about 45 to about 50 bushels per acre in fields that were sprayed with fungicide. Right, so fields that were sprayed with fungicide, in dry seasons, we were seeing that they were yielding about 5 bushels per acre more than fields that were not. And now, when we look at wet seasons, that advantage of fields receiving fungicide they were as high as about 15 bushels per acre. So in comparison, right, our yields were going up from 50 to about 65 or so. And in those wet seasons, we were also seeing an advantage of about 3 to 4 bushels per acre of resistant varieties in fields that were not sprayed with fungicide. So again, wet seasons, sprayed with fungicide, regardless of variety, we're seeing 10 to 15 bushels per acre yield gain. In wet seasons, when we did not have fungicide, we're seeing about a 4 bushel per acre yield advantage of resistant varieties. So it was very nice to see that from the producer data, we were actually confirming many of the things that we see in the experimental data. Now, when I say this 5 to 15 bushels per acre yield gain in the producer data, we need to keep in mind that these are not replicated trials, so there are many confounding factors behind. And what do I mean with these is that perhaps fields that were getting fodder fungicide, they might also be getting a little bit more nitrogen. They might also be getting sulfur. They might have been planted in an optimal time. We cannot say that 15 bushels per acre were directly due to fungicide applications, right? Because those fields were managed differently, so there are some confounding factors behind as well. That's where the experimental data comes in, really fine-tuning some of these findings that we had from the grower data. And by that I mean that in the experimental data, we're isolating the fungicide effect per se. And so what did we learn from that experimental data where there were no other confounding factors other than the fungicide itself, right? So across all those 12 years of field experiments that we looked at, whenever we were spraying fungicides, the yield advantage was about 8% across all varieties and across all environments. Now, when we narrow down and look into variety resistance to the major diseases that we have, then it starts to get a little bit more interesting because we see that in resistant varieties, that yield gain across all environments in those 12 years was about 6%. It went to about 7% in intermediate varieties, and all the way to close to 17% yield gain in those susceptible varieties. Now, is this 6, 7, 8% what I can expect always, or does it depend on weather conditions? And we also answer that, and it did depend on weather conditions. Specifically, if we look at the yield gain that we were having from the fungicide, they were very highly related to the amount of precipitation that we had in April and May. So the cumulative amount of rainfall in April and May was positively related to the yield gain from that fungicide, which is expected, right? But in some of those very high yielding seasons with very high rainfall amounts as well, many times the yield gain that we had from those foliar fungicides, they were north of 20, 30%, even for resistant varieties. And for susceptible ones, we were seeing some years, for example, if you look at variety Everest in a year like 2016, it may have gone 90% just due to that fungicide. So, for example, it was yielding 30 bushels per acre without a fungicide and 55 or 60 with that fungicide. Again, a super susceptible variety to stripe rust in a year where stripe rust was so prevalent as it was in 2016.
Comes down to this, Romulo, all of this is strong evidence that foliar fungicides can be a really good input investment, especially in those more rain-prone spring seasons.
Yes, that's the key message, right? In susceptible varieties, they're more warranted than in resistant ones, and in growing seasons where we had greater spring precipitation, foliar fungicides were more warranted as well than in drier seasons.
Excellent work as always. We appreciate you taking a few moments and reviewing it with us, and the best of luck as you continue on with your wheat research plot planting here in the coming days, Romulo. Thanks for your time, as always.
Thank you, Eric.
Romulo Lollato with us, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Rounding out this segment for you, a few USDA program notes out of your Farm Service Agency state office. Stopping by for that, an agricultural program specialist with the Kansas FSA, Tonya Ackerman, to cover 3 recent developments. Let's start, Tonya, with the Marketing Assistance Loan Program, which may have appeal to producers around this time of the year. Remind us of that, if you would.
Marketing Assistant Loans, or MALs as we call them, are short-term commodity loans. They mature in 9 months. This is a great opportunity for farmers to be able to keep their grain as opposed to selling it at harvest when sometimes the market's at a low price. And so they can strategically market their commodities. Producers have until March 31st if they would like to take out a wheat loan. And if they're interested in a corn, milo, or soybean loan, they can take those out until May 31st. We offer those MALs as farm-stored or as warehouse-stored loans. So for a warehouse-stored loan, you would need your warehouse receipt, either paper or electronic. A lot of the co-ops are using electronic warehouse receipts right now. They need to have their in-handling charges need to be taken care of, and also their storage throughout the maturity of the loan. And for a farm-stored, you need to certify your bushels, or you can request a measurement service on those. And one benefit to our loans is our very low interest rate. Right now, the interest rate for October is 1.25%.
So it's very manageable if one's looking to supplement their cash flow. This will be one way to do it while retaining ownership of that grain. And
yes.
that's how this works.
This is a very good option for them to look into. And this is a really busy time for us in the county office with our marketing assistant loans.
News on the Conservation Reserve Program, Tonya. The information on acceptance into a couple of the CRP options here, and we have some numbers for Kansas, you say.
Yes, we just completed a sign-up, and Kansas has a total of 1,766,454 acres enrolled in CRP. That's total acres in CRP. The general CRP for Kansas had 3,275 offers, and that resulted in 248,560 acres being enrolled in CRP. There's also a grassland sign-up, and we had 884 offers in Kansas, and that totaled 188,539 acres. And then we also have wetlands, and so for Kansas we have 19,614 acres enrolled in the wetlands.
That's a pretty decent level of acceptance into the program, isn't it?
Yes, we are the second in the nation as far as CRP, and so we're very proud of that fact. And also next year in 2022, we have 294,793 acres expiring, and there will be a sign-up next year.
Tell us a little more, if you would, Tonya, about the Dairy Margin Coverage Program for our dairy producers, something that hopefully will lend some assistance when it's needed for them economically.
Yes, the Dairy Margin Coverage Program, that we call it DMC because we love our acronyms, that helps the dairymen when the price of the fluid milk goes down and the price of the feed goes up. And so we have paid every month this year. It has triggered a program. In August of 2021, that payment rate was the highest on record. So it's nice that we're able to step in and help the dairymen in their time of need. We do expect payments to be made throughout the rest of this year, of 2021. They do pay 2 months in arrears, if you're not familiar with that. So the August payment was just made in October.
And we're talking about, because of the situation with the markets and high feed prices, these can be substantial levels of support, can't they, for producers?
Yes, it can. It triggers a payment based on that rate. We've gone years without a payment, but in 2021, things have been bad enough. It's triggered a payment every month, and they expect that for the next few months. This program runs by calendar year, and we should be having a sign-up. It's usually in October to December. That the dates have not been announced yet, but that should be coming in the near future.
Right.
And they'll be signing up for 2022 at that time.
Anybody that has questions about any of these programs or others can once again strike up that conversation locally, can't they?
Yes, they can. Our staff is very well versed in the different price support programs, and they should be able to answer any questions for them.
Excellent. A quick update on 3 major programs that the USDA administers through the FSA here in Kansas. Tonya, thanks for passing along a bit on each of those with us today.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Agricultural Program Specialist, Farm Service Agency, State Office for Kansas, Tonya Ackerman with us. You're listening to Agriculture Today. More for you shortly on the K-State Radio Network. Next up on Agriculture Today, the weekly segment for you dairy producers, courtesy of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. Dairy specialist Mike Brouk is standing by with another Milk Lines, and this time oriented toward you producers still looking to put up some late-season forage for winter dairy herd feeding. Mike with a recommendation along that line. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning what we might be doing with some of our fall forages. As we go into the fall, it's harder to get our forages to dry out if we're trying to put up dry hay. So one of the things you might be able to consider on your farm is wrapping that as wet hay, or what we call baleage. If you've never tried it, you might want to consider it. There's several advantages to it. Number one, we can harvest the crop and get it under cover or into a wrap situation much quicker than if we try to put up dry hay. Generally, we try to harvest this material at somewhere between 40 to 60% moisture. And again, a 60% moisture, 40% dry matter would probably be our goal, but we do see a lot of this forage put up at about a 50-50. So it really cuts the amount of time that we need to allow for drying out in the field particularly in the fall when we have cooler temperatures, shorter days, and we may also have more soil moisture that we're also dealing with at that time as well. So rather than waiting maybe 4, 5, or even 6 days for that crop to dry out in the field, we can maybe harvest it and bale it within about 3 days. So it cuts down the chances that we'll get stuck with some fall rain and maybe end up with very little forage at the end if we have to go 2 or 3 weeks before it actually dries out enough to bale. Obviously, there's great impacts on forage quality if we go through that much rain damage as well. On the feeding side, one of the advantages of baleage is it is a higher moisture crop, so it's easier for cows to consume. And actually, they prefer to consume it. They waste less material generally than what they would with dry hay. So our efficiencies in feeding go up. One of the concerns that you might have if you're considering this is you need to be careful about bale weight. Obviously, these are wet bales, so they're going to weigh much more than our dry bales. So we have to bale a bale that's smaller in diameter if we're putting up round bales to make sure that we can still lift it. Ideally, probably, we want to look at our equipment. Many times, baleage bales will weigh somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 pounds. So we need to make sure that we have tractors and equipment that can handle bales of that weight. If not, may not be an option that we want to consider. Final thing you might want to think about is total cost. It is a little more expensive to put up baleage just because of the plastic wrap that we use, and that would increase our cost a little bit. However, what you need to consider is it would reduce your wastage, both at the feeder, but also it would reduce your wastage that you might have in terms of loss of forage quality and also forage dry matter, because now that crop stored outside is wrapped, so it's protected from the moisture. So in many cases, even though we pay a little more on the front end, we gain a whole lot more on the back end. So our return on our investment actually is pretty good when we consider all these other factors that go into that decision. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider how they might be harvesting their last crop of hay or other forages this fall.
All right. Many thanks, Mike, as always. Well, ahead on tomorrow's broadcast, a visit with K-State Dean of Agriculture Ernie Minton, along with a land-grant university consultant, Simon Tripp of Techonomy Partners. They'll discuss a new analysis conducted by that firm of the economic impact of agricultural research out of Kansas State University. And as mentioned earlier in the week, the 2021 K-State Research and Extension Annual Conference is underway here on the campus. County and district agricultural agents from all around the state have assembled for that event. We're welcoming in several agricultural agents this week to talk over agriculture's fortunes in their locations this past year. Our first installment in that series is tomorrow. Be back with us then, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.